אתה בשתיקות, אתה הלב שלי שומע תפילות, תודה על ילדות, על משפחה, ועל בשם כולם הולכים בדרכך, תודה אם קשה לי לפעמים, כי רק אחרי החושך בעד החיים. אתה שומר עליי שלא אפול, אתה זאת צועק אליך, ממך כוחי נתת לי הכל, פרח העמוק שלי הגדול.
Hola a todos, muy buenas noches, Hanukkah Sameach. La verdad, muy agradecida, este Sot Hanukkah, la última vela de Hanukkah, porque nuestra historia es increíble. Cuando hablamos de historias de la Shoah, automáticamente es como algo muy, muy profundo en nuestro corazón, y la verdad esta historia es espectacular. Entonces quiero agradecer, como les digo, primero que nada a Hashem por la oportunidad y a todos ustedes por estar aquí esta noche, una noche más de inspiración, al equipo de Share Gesed, a Babra Mades, Linda Holtz, a toda esa gente que se encarga de llegar a todos lados difundiendo. Si quieren ser parte de Share Gesed, escríbanme, les explico cómo pueden ser. Y en esta ocasión quiero agradecer, un agradecimiento especial al More Jacobo Abadí, que fue el que nos ayudó a lograr conseguir a este súper personaje, porque es un personaje. Y bueno, tenemos dos opciones. Él va a hablar en inglés. Tenemos opción de traducción simultánea al español. ¿Cómo es? Si están en computadora se van hasta abajo, del lado derecho está un mundito que dice interpretación, ahí le dan clic, eligen español. Si están en celular, hasta abajo del lado derecho hay 3 puntitos donde dice más, igual le hacen clic y escogen español. Ahorita yo voy a hablar un poquito en inglés para darle la bienvenida. We are really, really excited, Dr. Byrne, to have you this night with this quorum that it's a really special quorum that we try on Sundays to bring spectacular stories that can fill our soul and our heart with hope and really beautiful feelings. And I'm sure that the story that you have for us tonight is gonna bring us exactly what we're searching on Sundays. Thank you so much for your kindness. Thank you for your time and for being here with us. So we are all yours. Thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Very nice introduction. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, it's perfect.
Am I still on
perfect.
mute?
Yes.
Oh, okay. We're online completely.
Yeah.
ערב טוב, שלום רב, חג שמח. אני חושב לדבר באנגלית זה הכי מתאים, בגלל ספרדית זה לא ממש ה-strong side, אבל אם אתם רוצים להמשיך בעברית, אפשר בעברית גם כן. החלטנו לאנגלית?
אנגלית, yes, אנגלית, please.
Oh, okay.
English, thank you, yes.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. Whenever I'm being invited to speak, if digitally, to Zoom or live or in front of an audience, I ask myself, what on earth am I? Because what I'm going to tell you is not a story that I made up. It's a story that my personal life. So to broadcast my personal life was not something I don't recommend it to anybody. It's something you should do on a routine basis. But I felt compelled to do it not because I suddenly asimon nafal, like we said in the old Hebrew, but because my son Tal asked me a very simple question. He asked me, Daddy, who is my grandfather? Abba mi asava sheli. Now for you, it's probably very easy to answer this question. For me, it's not. And therefore, I didn't talk about it even to my children. So how to explain a nice Jewish boy going to Jewish school, all my children, Jewish education, fill in the whole 9 yards, and therefore I have to work until the end of my life. Just kidding. But how do I explain a young man, a young soul, that on the one hand, his father, yours truly, me, myself, is a Jewish, is an Israeli, and served as a physician in a combat unit and of the IDF. On the other hand, my father, his grandfather, whom he never knew, was a highly decorated World War II German tank commander, an elite soldier, and a National Socialist, totally convinced about the ideology. So this huge gap between who I am, and who my father was never for me easy to bridge until I had to, because I needed to tell my son who I am and where he is coming from and his personal history. So every history and every life begins with the time of birth and where you were born in and where you're born at. And I was born in a gorgeous city in Bamberg, Germany on May the 9th, 1958. Now, Bamberg is an old town beyond medieval, 1,000 years old, nestled in south of Germany in Bavaria, nestled between two cities called Würzburg and Nuremberg. And Bamberg had a rich Jewish history, was never destroyed by any wars. And so history was all around us. History was part of our life. And when we as children were instructed to learn history in Bamberg, we walked to the city with our teachers. We had to name who lived where, why Bamberg is called the Rome of the North, because the only city outside Rome was built on 7 hills, and the center of the city was a massive cathedral. So a strong bastion of Catholic faith and belief. But there was something that I found strange, not because I'm smarter than others, but I noticed that certain aspect of history, nobody talked about it. As a child, I was about 9 years old, I knew that the war happened. I also knew that the war had a bad outcome, manifested by the state of mind that we had in a city of 75,000, 10,000 American soldiers and 5,000 family members. And when foreign soldiers stationed in a city, I knew that that's not a good sign that we won. We probably lost that one. That's all what I knew. Nobody talked about it. When I asked my parents about my family history, who is my grandfather, who are my grandparents, my parents didn't talk about it. They told me that they're gone because of the war. But I nudged them so many times that finally my father and my mother told me their respective story, their life story. And there were two different life stories, pretty much on the extremes. On the one hand, my father, who was very good father for me. I mean, he was tight, he was tough, and I only could address him as father, not as the German word's called Vater, very formal, it's father. Could never hug him, could never kiss him. But he showed me what I needed to learn. He showed me how to handle a rifle, how to shoot a rifle, how to hunt, how to fish. And long walks he had on Sunday afternoons in the forest, he told me over and over again his own story, that he was the youngest tank commander in the German army, serving under the command of an elite tanker called General Guderian, who actually developed the Blitzkrieg. And my father's tanks were the first to bridge the bridges, cut the frontiers, rolled into Poland on September the 1st, 1939. Then, of course, the next year, the attack on France, on Benelux, being Holland and Netherlands. And then in summer of 1941, in the late summer of 1941, the massive attack on the former Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. And for his accomplishment, my father was the first tanker who pushed east, and captured a strategically located city just before the way towards Moscow, which they never reached. And for his deed and his heroism, he was awarded the Knight's Cross by a man whom he still adoringly referred to as his Führer, Adolf Hitler. Now, I had no idea what Führer meant. I'd never heard the word Adolf Hitler, but I knew my father was a hero. And this message that my father was a hero was reinforced by his old war buddies, who came at least once a year to our house to celebrate the good old times, the war. And I was sitting there as a little munchkin next to these heroes of the war, and they adored my father and impressed upon me, Bernd, your father, Arthur, my first name was Arthur, is a hero, and you should never forget that. So my father was a hero. I had no way to question that. On the other hand, my mother told me a completely different story. The war is horror, the war is catastrophic. She was an ethnic German, born in Czechoslovakia, in an area called the Sudetenland along the border between Czechoslovakia, the former Czechoslovakia, and West Germany. And about 1.5, 1.6 million Sudetendeutsche, ethnic Germans, had to flee from the advancing Soviet troops and left everything behind. And my mother left behind her the beautiful house that she lived in. My grandfather, maternal grandfather, was a wealthy merchant. The villa was taken, the business was taken, everything lost, and her parents died just a year after they arrived in West Germany. So catastrophe. So on the one hand, glory, on the one hand, horror. But there were some things that I tried to connect, some impressions, some events that it later dawned on me there's more to the story. The first thing is we lived in this beautiful, on the first floor of this beautiful matrician-style building in downtown Bamberg, as large as a football field. Well, not going to be extreme, but almost. And the entire second floor was taken by the landlady. And my mother told me, do not speak to the landlady unless spoken to, because she's a countess, she's a noblewoman. And when we walked into the building, we had to climb a flight of stairs. Our apartment was on the left side, on the right side was the wooden massive stairs up to the landlord's lady apartment. And right next to it, on the wall, was mounted a portrait of a man, a painting, who looked like my father, whose pictures I saw at home, in uniform with the officer's insignia on the shoulder, the knight's cross around his neck, and the officer's cap. He had a higher rank than my father, I knew that, but when I asked my father who this man was, or this painting depicted, he looked at me and said, "No, never ask me about him. He was a traitor." Well, the traitor that my father called a traitor was nobody else than Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, the German colonel who was leading the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944, which failed. His widow, Nina von Stauffenberg, lived upstairs. She, 2 days after the event of July 1944, she was arrested, thrown in a concentration camp in Ravensbrück, survived because 2 German officers tried to keep her alive, and also gave birth to a child in prison. Her 3 other children were given up for adoption, and then in the final days of the war, sent to Buchenwald for final treatment. Thanks to God, they were rescued, and the family was reunited. So here was a man who was, according to my father, a bad person, and here were pictures of my father who looked like this man, a good person, a simple logic of a child. What is wrong with that? I asked myself. Now, I would love to get the whole history, but I knew that my parents didn't allow me to go upstairs and play with the landlady's grandchildren. But on Sundays, after lunch, my parents were tired. They went to bed for an hour or 2, a siesta. And I used the time and sneaked upstairs and wanted to play with the grandchildren. And I remember in this huge apartment, wall to wall, pictures, hundreds of pictures of her with her husband, a loving, caring couple. So why is my father speaking about him that he was a bad person, a traitor, and I experienced something completely different? And there were other clues. One clue, we lived in downtown Bamberg, not far away from the center of Bamberg, and there was a dentist located in the second floor, in the third floor of a building, which looked like our house, a patrician-style building. And I remember the first time I went to the dentist. I love to go to the dentist, probably because it's the only way to get out of the house. My mother was so overprotective. So when we walked into this same building, like in our building, a flight of stairs, up in front of me was a beautiful door with glass hinges, and above the door was a star, mounted a star on the wall. Now, I was Catholic. I never saw a star, so spent plenty of crosses. So of course I was drawn to this something unusual. And I asked my mom, what is that? And I remember my mother taking my hand, walking up the stairs, squeezing it, and almost pulled me and told me, "Don't ever ask me about that." So this was the building of the Jewish community, which of course was non-existent anymore, except a few Jews. And that was the Golden Star, was the Magen David. First time I saw something like that, and I was fascinated. And then came in school, we started to talk about that war. We started to talk about the time between 1933 and 1945. I was about 12, 13 years old. And the way we talked about it, at least in our school, was the following. Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933. He was appointed as the member, as the leader of the largest party in the parliament of Germany. The last election took place in November 1932. So he was legally elected. Was appointed in January 1933 by his predecessor, Papen, and under the blessing, so to say, by the prime minister, the president of Germany, Hindenburg, to be the prime minister. And he immediately established very quickly an authoritarian and then dictatorial fascist regime. Many people disappeared in so-called work camps where they had to be working, and that's what we were told. Hitler started the Second World War in 1939. We lost that war on 8th of May 1945. Germany surrendered, capitulated, and then on the 9th of May it was all over, and everybody disappeared like a group of Huns invaded Germany. Now that was, of course, a bunch of horse manure. I don't want to use that word. It was a lie. And what the truth was, we experienced, we as the first generation, during 1972, when an event happened in Germany that shook everything up. The Olympics in Germany, in Munich, in summer, August 1972. And this was supposed to be the event that should demonstrate to the world that this is a new Germany, a democratic Germany, not like in the East. Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union and were forced to adapt to a communist lifestyle, so to say, whereas we were a democratic Germany embedded in the democracy and in the military alliance of the NATO. And we were led at that time by a chancellor called Willy Brandt, who was the first post-war German politician, West German politician, who was not tainted by the past. He was not a Nazi like his predecessor, Coach Georg Kiesinger, who was the prime minister from 1966 to 1969, and whose presence on the political stage was a constant reason for young students of my generation to demonstrate against him. And Willy Brandt, a socialist who escaped Germany in 1933, returned to Germany in 1946, rebuilding his party, called the then Social Democratic Party, rose to power in a landslide election in 1969. And his first act in foreign policy, in December 1970, he traveled to Poland, and in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, he sank on his knees, bowed his head, and asked for forgiveness what Germany did. This was unheard of, unseen of. The German chancellor kneeling on the floor, asking for forgiveness. And a picture that went around the world, posted on the front page of every newspaper, including the newspaper in our house. And my father in the morning slammed the newspaper on the breakfast table, yelling and screaming in German, "Schau mal her, Bernd, wieder ein Verräter." Look, Bernd, again a traitor. Now, I was confused. I was raised as an Orthodox Catholic. My father was a Protestant that didn't practice, but allowed my mother, an Orthodox Catholic, to raise us children in the faith of her choice. And I was, of course, Orthodox Catholicism. And I went to elementary school, a Catholic elementary school, run by nuns. I went to previously in a kindergarten, the same thing. Was an altar boy, and my mother had always the dream, for me the nightmare, that I should become a priest. That didn't work out, obviously. So for me, a man kneeling in front of a memorial was something positive in my faith. And in school, this event really shook everybody up. And the teachers, our teachers, for the first time, started to talk about the reality, what happened during the time of 1933 and 1945. And for the first time, I heard the word Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek. Murder of 6 million, not as collateral damage of war like we learned in school. 6 million died as a deliberate ethnic cleansing campaign, murder on an epic scale, conducted by the German government, democratically elected German government, in the name of Germany. And I was shocked, not only by what I heard, but by the fact that I didn't know about it. And why nobody talked with us about it until now. Our teachers cried, some of them cried. It must have been very, very serious. And on the way back home, I decided to ask my father about what really happened, because he should have known. He was the hero. And I remember when he asked me, what happened in school today? Did they teach you anything new? Look, let's open the books and read something else. He was a very, very intelligent man. He challenged me intellectually very often in reading and asking questions about history. So asking about, Father, we learned about the Holocaust. He looked at me, the Holocaust? Well, that's a lie. Your teachers are communists. It never happened. And we don't talk in my house about that. Now, that was for me to be caught between the rock and the hard place, Scylla and Charybdis. On the one hand, my father told me that this was a lie. On the other hand, my teachers, whom I trusted and give us the appropriate information, were telling us something else. So somebody's lying here. And I started to read ferociously whatever I could find. Books about the Third Reich, books about the mass murder in English, in French, in German. And the longer I read, the more I read, I had a sinking feeling that my father wouldn't tell me the truth because he was involved. And I decided to ask him what happened. Now, as you can imagine, my father was not kind of the person who gave me standing ovations when I asked him about the time in the past. And I had to really gauge the moment, how I can talk to him. Now, that was not too difficult, but because my father was a drunk, an alcoholic. And as an alcoholic, he had 3 phases to go through every day. Phase 1, he was looking for a drink, but he was still very irritated and not approachable. Phase 2, he was in the twilight zone. He was almost drunk. I called it now the Schicker zone, but I make it up. And stage 3 was he was completely blasted. So in stage 2, I could really poke and find out what he did. I also could manipulate him, get money out of him. And the revelations, what he told me, were actually grouped in the same 3 phases. Phase 1, Bernd, whatever allegedly happened, he said, allegedly, we didn't do it, me, the Wehrmacht. We were above it all. This was all the SS. Now, that was a blatant lie, and I could prove it later on, but this was a lie. His unit was involved in mass murder, I found out later. I found pictures 25 years later, and still researching whatever I could. After the archives in the East opened after the fall of the wall, tons of material could be reviewed. And I hired a historian to find out of my father. And what I found was horrible. And there were pictures of him sitting next to Heinrich Himmler in 1942. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, sits here with a high-ranking German elite officer, tank officer. This was not about talking about tanks. This was about how the army could safeguard and could protect the killing zones that the SS used for mass murder. That was, of course, something I didn't know. And I also found out that my father signed a letter in 1943, in which he described the capture of 600 Russian prisoners of war that needed to be transferred to Birkenau for final treatment. Now, unfortunately, Auschwitz and Birkenau was also the death killing field of captured Russian soldiers. And these 600 men that he sent to their death, he never acknowledged it. It was him just like animals. The second phase began with the following. Well, Bernd, there was some stuff going on, but all those people that were killed, allegedly, were not wearing a uniform and had a weapon, therefore they didn't belong under the protection of the Geneva Convention, the rules of war. They were considered guerrillas and terrorists, and so we could kill them. Now that was, of course, total lie, because there were many civilians, only civilians out there. Maybe here and there's somebody who fought against as a partisan. And I asked him rhetorically, you tell me that 1 million plus children were herded in the concentration camps, were sent to the gas chamber, their bodies burned and their ashes scattered over the killing fields of Auschwitz and Birkenau, Majdanek and Treblinka. This is not feasible. And then one day was the final third phase, one time only. He was drunk as hell. And he started. He said, look, your generation, you specifically, you're weak. You're not a man. You're not somebody who can create a nation. We as Germans, we went into not only to fight a war, but to exterminate all this lichluch, the dirt, the vermins. We had to do it because the world should give us a Nobel Prize for it, because nobody liked the Jews anyway. Now that was the final straw that broke the camel's back. I didn't talk to him anymore. I considered him not a hero, which was very emotional, but as a common criminal. And I asked myself, how can I break this deadly cycle? I need to understand, I need to learn what happened. and I need to understand much more than I could read in books. So I approached one of my teachers, a former Jesuit priest, and he looked at me and said, Bernd, I belong to a generation that was born during the war, and I had to come to terms after the war, and my father never came back, that something horrible happened. And I committed myself to the study of the Catholic faith. I became a priest, and now I'm a teacher. And I learned, like every good Catholic, that we have to make amends. And I looked at him and said, well, amends means I make amends to those who were harmed, but I don't know Jews. The only thing I knew about Jews, the Jews killed Jesus. That was all what they told us in Sunday school. And he said, look, I will arrange a meeting between you and a group of Israelis. We, as a progressive wing in the Catholic Church, inviting once a year a group of Israelis, Jews and Arabs alike, from Neve Shalom to Germany for a 1-week trip, 10 days trip. And we always encourage young 1 or 2 Germans to participate. And I was the chosen German to participate. And when young people get together, I mean, I was 18, I was 19, they were 18. We start to learn from each other what music you like, what food you like. I have to admit, I like the Israeli girls a heck of a lot. They're good looking. And I bonded with an Israeli girl, and she noticed my interest, and she looked at me and said, Tacheles, if you like me and you want to go any further, you have to come to Israel and meet my parents. And I said, as a big Schweizer, of course I will do that. There was only a tiny problem. I had no money and no passport. But I was so awestruck and so motivated to go to Israel to meet her again that I worked during the summer. I got a new passport for the first time, and I traveled to Israel in a way that I do not recommend you to do it. I took a train from Bamberg into Munich. From there, we crossed the Alps in another train, and we arrived in Ancona, the port city of Ancona in Italy, to be boarded on a ferry, and I slept on deck. Again, this was not a cruise. And we shipped it throughout the Mediterranean, stopped in Piraeus for reprovisioning. And I sent her a telex. Imagine this was the time before cell phone, Google, Schmoogle, TikTok, Tactic, whatever it is. This was just hard work writing it out. So she knew that I would arrive at that in the day and then the time with the ferry from Piraeus. And I remember when we approached that morning, the harbor, early in the morning, 5 o'clock. And I remember when the sun was rising, the mountains, the closer we came to Haifa, the mountains reaching out of the sea, a beautiful sunrise. And it was very emotional because many male members on deck prayed with the tefillin and the talit. And I said, this is unbelievable. This is like magic. And when we approached the customs area, all my fascination was wiped away and replaced by fear. What happened if anybody would recognize my name because my father did something to them? Irrational fear, I don't know, but maybe irrational. But when I passed through customs, all the doubts were wiped away because she was waiting there, embraced me and said, let's go to visit my parents. We took a community taxi, which was called Shirut, drove up to Neve Shanan, which was on the Carmel Mountain, a working class neighborhood at that time. And her parents were waiting outside this tiny little house. There were rows of tiny houses, and embraced me as if I would be the long lost son, chit-chatted with me in Yiddish. Her father took my rucksack, her mother took the bag. She spoke in Yiddish only too. I had no idea what they were talking about. And they guided me in a house which was literally a living room, maybe 1+. They moved all in a tiny room. They gave me the living room to sleep, dished up in the evening in a tiny kitchen, just whatever they could afford, hummus, trina, everything pita, sata, everything I never ate in my life before. And they were trying to communicate with me. And her daughter was translating and interpreting. But suddenly her father looked at me sternly and asked me in German, clear German, haltingly though, if you want to speak German, I can speak German too. And I looked at him, how did you learn German? I shouldn't have asked the question because he looked at me, pulled up the sleeve of his left forearm where the number was tattooed and told me, Auschwitz, Auschwitz, Auschwitz. And I wanted to sink in the floor and disappear. Here I'm for the first time in a home of a Jewish family in Israel, Holocaust survivors. What will happen to me? And he put his hand gently on my elbow and said, don't be fearful. I was received in Germany by the American forces. They set us up in deep displaced person camps. And I had to learn that Germans are not all Germans are monsters. Some are not. And I migrated to Israel in 1948, but I want to know from you, do they talk about that? Do they teach you? And I said, no. And he looked at me and said, then I will go with you to a place where you will learn. And he took a day off from work. He was a foreman in the port of Haifa, a very strong man. And he traveled with me to Yerushalayim by bus, and we went to the Holocaust Memorial, Yad Vashem. And he took me by his hand, not in order to torture me, but to guide me step by step to the exhibits to understand what happened. When he went through, I was done. I was emotionally, I broke down, I cried. And he said, look, this is something that you have to understand. And so you have to go to pain to understand, because nobody can understand. And I asked myself, how can this man who hosts me in his house, who take time off from work to show me what's going to happen, how can they rebuild their personal life, their professional life, and build a new country, an old country anew? These are unique people. I want to learn more about it. And on my way back to Germany, I had enough time to think. And I decided I will approach a Jewish community in Germany. Well, good luck. In the mid-70s, Germany was the hotbed of terrorists, Baader Meinhof, Red Army faction, German terrorists who affiliated themselves with the extreme left. And of course, everything was shaken up in Germany already from these terrible events in 1972, the murder of the Israeli athletes in Munich. And for that, I was not prepared to hear what happened. Because when that happened in 1972, my father was the one who got crazy about it. And I remember when I came home and we had to digest the information, what happened to Israeli athletes, my father was yelling and screaming. I don't know if you remember what happened in 1972. I was barely 14 years old when the Israeli athletes that were proudly paraded into the stadium a few days before were brutally murdered by a group of terrorists. And in the failed rescue attempt in Fürstenfeldbruck, in a military airport, all Israelis were killed. And I saw it on TV live. So this was a wound that never stopped healing. And I know how important it was for Israelis and how important it was for Germans. On the one hand, to talk about it at this event, and then, or not talk about it, and about the Israelis to understand what happened, and not to blame the Germans what happened, but to blame international terrorists. So in this kind of morass of horrible history, I came back to, and you couldn't go to visit families in Germany, Jewish families. You couldn't enter or even approach Jewish house of worship, because the 25,000 Jews in Germany at that time were hiding more or less in the three largest communities in Frankfurt, Munich, and Berlin. And so meeting a Jew was impossible because there was armed police with police carriers with semi-tanks in front of every Jewish community. So forget it to get into these communities. That was the message from 1972, the murder on Israeli athletes. But I found this small Jewish community hidden in my own hometown, the entrance hidden from the public because the entrance was in the backyard. And on the plate written right next to it was written, Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, Jewish Community Center. Not even Jewish community. I remember I knocked at that door and loudly knocked at that door. And an old man opened the door who was tiny, very pale, and didn't open the door for me completely. And I started to ramble or whatever. I probably talked to him that he felt comfortable enough to let me in. And I remember this first walk into this Jewish community was leading us to a dark room, so to say, or more like a hallway, which was just lit by a light in the left upper corner, a red light. And the walls were covered with granite plates, covered with names all over. And I asked him, what does it mean? He looked at me, you don't know? These are the names of all members of the Jewish community who never came back from Theresienstadt. Most of them were winded up in Theresienstadt or Auschwitz. And this light in the corner is the red light. It's called Ner Tamid, that we always should light in our heart, never to forget that. So this symbolism, this strong symbolism impressed upon me. And he walked me through the community. There was it was a Stibelech, a Beit Stibelech. There was a Aron Kodesh, a Bima, and that was all. And two Torah scrolls rescued from Holocaust. And we walked into his office, which was a brightly lit but There was no air condition, no fan. It was a hot summer day, windows closed, curtain drawn. And he was sitting down and took off his jacket, and his short-sleeved shirt revealed on the pale skin the number. And I couldn't stop staring on it. And he looked at me, what are you staring on? This number, this is Auschwitz. My name is Itzhak Rosenberg. I'm the chair of the Jewish community. I'm an Auschwitz survivor. What do you want? Tough as nails. Tiny man, but tough as nails. And I told him my story, and he said, that's a very sad story. If you want to learn more about Jews, I give you a few books. I entrust you to bring it back. And I stopped him there and said, I don't want to read books. I did that for a long time. I want to learn. I want to learn about you. I want to give something back. And he looked at me. Well, young man, if you want to learn something and you want me to give you something, we have to make a geschäft. On the one hand, I will teach you. On the other hand, you will be my Shabbos goy, our Shabbos goy, to help us during Shabbat, and that's equal. You work and we teach. I had no idea what was a Shabbos goy, Shabbos shmoy. I had no idea at all. But it sounded like a great opportunity to get into a Jewish community. I said, what do I have to do? I said, no problem. You come on Friday at 6 o'clock and I'll show you what to do. I was there at 6 o'clock bull, exactly. He didn't come until 6:30, not at 7. At 7:30, he strolled in. I said, what's Masna? What are you doing here? I said, you said 6 o'clock. I said 6. It's so much in German. 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, you learned from us. Never, Jewish time is a little bit different. He was joking. He had a sick, wicked humor. And then he showed me what to do. Set up the table, lit up the candles, make the food ready, prepare the coffee. So every labor that a Jew during Shabbat cannot do. And he told me one thing. He said, look, this is the only safe space for the members of our Jewish community. We have about almost barely 25 to 30 members, all Holocaust survivors with their families. And when they see a stranger, a goy, in their midst, they get upset. So be prepared, but don't worry. And indeed, when the first members of the community came in and they noticed me, they told Itzhak in Yiddish, was nach der goy dort? And Itzhak said, look, the alte kacker, that's what I didn't say. The alte kackers, they forget about them. And so I came every Friday, every Saturday, week by week, month by month, holiday by holiday, year by year. And the closer I came to his family of choice, the more I distanced myself from the family of origin, my family. And it came to a blow up. I mean, there were several big blow ups, but the final blow up came on Christmas, when Christmas fell on a Friday night. And on Friday night, it was very clear to me, I had to go to the temple. But Christmas, on the other hand, for my mother, an Orthodox Catholic, was this huge affair. And I remember I can run it like a movie in my head, like a tape. We went in the early evening to get to the cathedral to participate in the mass, Christmas mass. Came back and my mother had already prepared carp and lentil soup, symbolic food for Catholics. And we waited for our father to ring the bell so my mother could open the massive wooden door leading into this huge room with the Christmas tree in the corner, decorated with real candles. And my father standing next to it with his finest dark suit with the Knight's Cross around his neck, singing festive Christmas hymns. And I had it. I mean, I blew up. This was just too much. I said, let's stop this Greek tragedy. This is not normal. You celebrate the birth of Christ by wearing this nasty metal around your neck? You're a murderer. Don't you get it? You're a murderer. And my father looked at me. My mother cried. He said, raus, get out. Well, that was a little problem because I had ein kesef, no money, no ein kesef, kein Geld. But I was in the second to last year in medical school. I had a scholarship which barely helped me to go to school. And I was under tight straits, and I never asked for money in the community. And suddenly, Itzhak must have told somebody, suddenly a member of the community who never talked to me for 5 years, that I was already there. He looked at me and said, "Du bist der Goy, you're the Goy." Oh, very perceptive, yeah. Can you tell me why you have these dirty shoes and the dirty shoes, schmutzige Schuhe, schmutzige Jacke, schmutziges Hemd? It was not true. Buy something better. Here, take 100 mark, which was a lot of money, and buy new shoes and new shirt. And I was on the one hand belittled and offended by what he said, which is not true. On the other hand, he gave me 100 mark. So I walked to Itzhak. Itzhak was my quasi-father. And I said, Itzhak is sitting in his office. Aaron, that was his name, gave me 100 mark. Aaron gave you 100 mark? He never gives anybody money. Did you ask him for 200? I said, why should I? Because you're a goy. I come, sit down. Listen to me. You don't understand one important part. We're physically here, but often emotionally torn and just empty. I had the good luck to meet a non-Jewish German woman who was married to a Jewish man before, who did never return from Auschwitz. And we married, and she built a beautiful family for us. She converted, we had children, and it was wonderful. But Aaron we don't even know anything about him except from the Red Cross and entry that he was in Auschwitz. He doesn't talk about it. And Aaron, out of whatever reason, chose me as the person who should receive the story out of his mouth, the story which just turns my stomach upside down. For the last 6 months of his life, unfortunately, he told me as much as he could about what happened. He was belonging to a Sonderkommando in Auschwitz. Now, a Sonderkommandos were a group of Jews who guided the victims waiting for the gas chamber into the first chamber, giving him a card, a plastic card with a number, and two cards. Said this one you hang when you get undressed on the ropes. You put your number there, so we can identify your clothing. You get it back when you get on the other side. And so he could calm them down. They could calm them down approximately. Then the door was closed shut. The SS sharks threw cyanide gas, Cyclone B, into the chamber. And not like you heard in stories that the death was tough but short. It took up to 20 to 30 minutes, according to Aaron. When the banging stopped, the Sonderkommando, now equipped with gas masks, opened the doors on the other side, pulled out the bodies, broke out the gold teeth that they could find, burned the bodies, crushed the bones, and scattered the remnants in the pits right next to the crematorium. For that, they were rewarded with alcohol, women, as many as they could want, meat, food, anything they could eat. And 90 days later, the second group came in, and the first group was gassed. He survived. And he died about 6 months after he told me the story. It probably was his last way to say goodbye, that I should keep a Jew, non-Jew, a son of a National Socialist, should harbor these memories and should tell others. When he died, I was in the last year of medicine at a rotating internship in university in Bamberg, in Erlangen, about 60 miles outside from Bamberg. And I got a call in the evening, Bernd, you have to come, Aaron died. I immediately rushed to Bamberg. Everybody was assembled in a small community center. And they looked at me and said, Bernd, we need to prepare him over the night, and then we need to bury him, and we need a strong man to help us. We're all old. He said, I cannot do it. I'm not a Jew, even if I wanted to. Itzhak looked at me, you're one of us. So we prepared him according to the rituals, Aaron's body. The next day, we buried him out in the Jewish cemetery, and Itzhak looked at me, gave me a prayer book, put up the page of the Kaddish, pointed out, say it, he was your friend. I said, Itzhak, I cannot say it. I'm not a Jew. I don't want to offend anybody. I said, you're one of us. And I said the Kaddish. And I knew I crossed the line. That was crossing the line in a big way. Because I said, if they trust me so much and I'm part of this family, which I never had, I want to be a Jew. And I told Itzhak, I want to become a Jew. Itzhak looked at me and said, this is not a good idea. Did you already forget what happened to me and to others, the number? Suffering. You're a tzedek, you're a righteous man. You can spread the news about how not all Germans are bad. Don't do it. I said, I want to. He looked at me and said, I feared that this moment would happen. And I put some money aside. I will send you to Frankfurt. You will stay there. I pay all expenses paid holiday for the next 3 days with the rabbi whom I already will contact. And the rabbi will tell you that it's an idea that you should get rid of as quickly as you can. And I met the rabbi. He told me, I will teach you anything you want, but no conversions for Germans that have no pressing reason. And so for the next 2 years, I studied with him off and on. And every time I met him, I asked him the question anew, when can I convert? And he finally broke. I said, you're not, Nick, you're crazy. You drive me crazy. He said, if it was in March 1986, if you want to become a Jew, which I no doubt you have the intellectual capacity, you need to undergo several procedures and several acts of faith until the rabbinical court, who will hear your case in December, will act. And they may act against you or in favor of you. And during this time, I told you, you have to make some adjustments to your physique. One of them implies a surgery. I want to talk about it. And it's not a plastic surgery of the nose, it's something else. It had to be done in an Orthodox kosher hospital in Switzerland, because it was the only one that was available. Then 3 months later, I had to travel to a Jewish community, actually an Orthodox Hasidic community in Metz, France, which maintained a mikveh, which was hundreds and hundreds of years old, and underwent to the mikveh. And now afterwards, I remember I had this date for the rabbis, and it was not a date that I was prepared for. This was a date preparing for what I never believed it would happen to me, the conversion to be a Jew. And I remember the rabbis were sitting downstairs, they were sitting upstairs in a elevated podium. I was sitting downstairs and looking up, and they were wearing black, dressing the head of the like a judge, shofet. They were looking very sternly at me. And I told them my story. They asked me some questions about perfunctory question about knowledge of Judaism. And then the chief rabbi said, stop. Bernd, can I call you Bernd? I understand that you're a good man. I have here letters of recommendation. I have here the story, what you did, kol hakavod. But I will not convert you just because of facts that are written on paper. I want to hear your conviction, why you convert. And I told him my story the way I felt it, not chronologically, but what my father did and what I felt. And he retreated with the entire court. They came back after half an hour. It was the longest half an hour of my life. They asked me to stand up, and I stood up, and the rabbi said, are you ready? He read the conversion certificate in Hebrew and then in German. And said, it was a very tense atmosphere. He looked at me, did you already choose a name? No, I don't know what you mean. Well, the last name we give you to is Ben Abraham, but the first name you can choose. I said, what is your first name, Bernd? He said, Bernd. You know what it means? I said, no, the bear slayer. Okay, take it, Dubi, Dov, Dubili, take it, it's free. And so I crossed the line and became a Jew. It was such a moment that's beyond emotional. And he asked me the second question, what do you want to do? And I said, look, Rabbi, I have no money to give for what my people did to your people. I have a profession. I'm just graduated from medical school, but I'm still young and not fully experienced. That will help not so much. But I want to serve in the army and fight for something I believe in. And that's what I did. 1 month later, within that month, I was approaching the Jewish agency in the Israeli embassy in Germany. Immediately, I was issued a Chok HaShavut, the law of return, stamped into my passport, and a one-way ticket from Frankfurt to Tel Aviv for the 7th of January, 1987. And last time I visited Itzhak, he was sad, but he knew that I had to do what I had to do. He said, Bernd, whenever there's a problem, call me. I doubt that you will. But ask me, I'll have to ask you the tough question. Did you say goodbye to your parents? I said, no, I don't. But how can you be a Jew not saying goodbye? You have to come above your faith and act within your faith and say goodbye, which I tried. I approached the house. My mother was standing outside when she saw me coming, crying and crying. And my father didn't ask me to come in, not at all. He was standing there drinking, completely blasted, yelling at me, should get the hell out of here. And so, which I did. Next day, I flew from Frankfurt to Tel Aviv. I was assigned to a kibbutz. I remember my first klita encounter, immigrant encounter. It was the old airport in Lod. It was the Olim. In the evening, it was about 9 o'clock at least. And one bureaucrat sat there behind a glass window, and nobody else was there. And he looked at me and said, papers. He looked at the papers, that it was proper. Said, Yesh lacha kesef, you have money? I said, what? Do I have to bribe him? No, because if you want, you have to ask it that, because there are two options. If you have money, you go to Ulpan Akiva and in Yerushalayim, And if you don't have money, you go to the Utpan in a kibbutz. And I said, well, kibbutz sounds good because it's the only option that I had. And I was assigned to a kibbutz the same night. 6 months later, after I learned barely Hebrew and did a lot of hard work in banana fields. If anybody is interested to know about bananas, please ask me. I was assigned to a hospital in downtown Tel Aviv, HIJO, did my 1-year rotating internship. And within a month after my discharge, after my finishing the internship, I was assigned to the Israeli army. I was drafted. I immediately volunteered to do whatever I have to do. I went in basic training, officers training, and then assignment to a combat unit in the West Bank. This was the first month of the first Intifada in 1988, 88, I think. And it was a combat zone, a war zone. And I remember I was in Beit El, which is a hill overlooking Ramallah on the one side, and Beit El, the settlement, on the other side. And I was standing there in my uniform and fully armed, a Galil assault rifle fully loaded with cartridges. I had a handgun, a 9mm, and I was in uniform of a lieutenant. And the commanding officer said, "Look, guys, Jefe, this doctor is your doctor now. If there's any problem, to call him, and his name is," you have to change your name. We call him doctor. And here I was standing in front of young soldiers that looked at me, and I felt like a Nazi in drag. I said, they don't know me. They don't know who I am. I was fearful. And I didn't talk about my life at all. So I decided to throw my life in this virtual closet, slam the door shut, turn the key in the lock, and try to throw the key away, which was a big mistake. And until my son Tal asked me the simple question, "Daddy, who is my grandfather?" And I told him. And his reaction was, "Dad, that's a cool story. Let me tell in school." Everybody said, "Hold the horses, don't do that." And well, my luck, there was a family history day 3 weeks later, approximately, after his revelation. And I was told I was not there, that my son in class, when you're talking about family history, clipped his finger and raised his arm and said, "And my grandfather was a famous Nazi." Now, when you go to a Jewish school and you say something like that, there's a big problem. And I was called to the principal's office, and the principal, together with the rabbi, told me, "Bernd, Dr. Wolfschläger, Dov, you're a member of our community, highly held in highest esteem, and your son Tal told us as verdrehte Geschichte that your father was a Nazi. What's wrong with Tal? Is he on drugs?" I said, "He's not on drugs." He told me the truth. And the rabbi looked at me. "You want to talk about it?" I said, "No, you will." He took my hand, walked me to his classroom, and said, "Talk." And I knew what would happen. I didn't know what happened, but I knew what could have happened. And what have happened is all the weight was lifted off my shoulders. I, for the first time, talked the truth. And I asked myself, I need to close the circle of life that you opened so many years ago. I need to go home. And I took my son a month later. We traveled to Germany on a cold December day, 2004. And we visited my parents at the only place I could visit them, in a cemetery. And the cemetery is a unique location because in Bamberg, called the area around Bamberg called Franconia, Jews and non-Jews lived and worked together. And they had common cemeteries, only separated by a wall. And my parents' plot is located 1 row parallel to the wall that separates the Christians from the Jewish cemetery. When you go to Bamberg, hopefully you will, look it up. And their gravesite is on certain times of the day, the Jewish gravestones on the other side casted a shadow on my parents' gravesite. And I was standing there holding back my tears and almost choking up, and told my son, "Look, this is my father's and my mother's gravesite, the eternal rest. And these were your grandparents. They never stepped out of the shadow of history. They, as a symbolism, their gravesite is still covered by the shadow of history. What I had to do is to step out of the shadow, took it upon myself to learn as much as I could what happened, kept full responsibility, looking back and moving forward with the complete resolve that it should never happen again. And that's what I'm doing. I'm not going all the time to the cemetery, but I learned my lesson. I make it a point, not because I want to be famous, not at all. I wanted to teach others that persons can change. If I can change as a normal German, others can change. You know, it doesn't mean a way for conversions, but at least admit what happened was our responsibility, and we have to do something about it. I did it to the extreme. I went to the army. I was stationed in a hotel, in a hell. I was in combat, was slightly wounded in one combat unit activity. I was willing to give it all up. But thanks to God I didn't, because what I learned from my life experience, that hatred is not this amorphous dark matter of the universe that nobody understands and it just causes trouble. No, hatred is something that we generate every day with words of hatred, prejudice, racism, anti-Semitism. If these words of hatred are not being countered by, they fall on the fertile ground, the mind of others, and they sprout into deeds. And if these deeds left unchallenged, they form habits. If these habits prevail, characters will be shaped. And these characters will dictate the development of social norms. What it means is, it is normal to kill Jews because everybody does it. It's not out of the row. That was what happened in Germany. And these mechanisms don't relate only to Germans. It's not only Germans not to take them off the hot plate and to take the full responsibility, but others did too. So it's a universal dynamic that we have to face. Because how do you explain Cambodia, the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge in 1974, 1972, 1973? Millions died. The murder of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Syrians in our time in Syria over the course of the civil war. The mass murder in Rwanda. The mechanisms are the same in different settings. What can we do? We have to fight back. Not necessarily with a weapon, but we have to stand up and fight for ourselves, because we are the canary in the coal mine. When something happens against Jews, it will happen against others too. It will. That means you don't have to be the piñata de jour, but we have to stand up and say proudly that we're Jews. And I thought that that was enough. For many years, I published my book in 2007 and self-published it, just gave it to my family members. And other people asked me to present, and so like a tsunami, I went to the entire world. I had the privilege to see Jewish communities in faraway lands out of Australia, South Africa, and other places. And I came to the conclusion there's a lot of work to be done. And unfortunately, the work that we did, as those of us who fight against it, against anti-Semitism, is like a one step forwards, three back, not two back, because anti-Semitism is on the rise. Let's not talk about politics, we're talking about the policies of politicians. A very well-known American general, Hayden, who was the head of the CIA, the head of the NSA, a very knowledgeable general, told in an interview the following: we're living in a post-truth, pre-fascism era. Post-truth means don't listen to the truth. I, as the leader, will tell you what's true. This is all a lie. Don't have to form your opinion. It's all a lie. I tell you what's true. And there's fascism as the leader that takes away all the others that threaten you and establishes an authoritarian, fascist, or dictatorial regime. And this happens right now. I'm not paranoid, I'm not delusional. Some people think that we have to be careful. Not careful tiptoeing around the fact that we're Jews. We should be proud as Jews. Not hiding that we are a keeper, that we're Jews. Being aware that we have a Eretz Israel, Medinat Israel, who will be the place where we can go, but not flee. And I do that every day. Not necessarily provoking anti-Semitic remarks, but listen very carefully. And when somebody comes down to me, like it happened a few months ago, when a patient of me, it came to me and said, you're sure that you calculated the bill ready? Because instead of 120, your staff bought 130. You Jews are all the same, all about money. I looked at him, you better get out of here. Better get out of here. But it happens over and over again. So not to make you angry or fearful, but hopefully more resolved that as I am a proud Jew, a proud Israeli, and served my country in good times and in bad times in war, that I look up up and look in my mirror and said, against all odds, change is possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Byrne. Spectacular. I thought it was great, but it's greater than I thought. Baruch Hashem. Thank you so much. They're asking, can we have a little bit of questions or we can't?
Sure.
Well, okay, they're asking, first of all, what's the name of the book they want to purchase?
It's called A German Life Against All Changes Possible. The printed version, we reprint because there was so much in demand. And it will come soon back. But the digital version, the Kindle version, is available for download still, obviously.
Okay.
It's available in Hebrew as Betzel Ha'av, published in Idiot Achonot, Betzel Ha'av. In Portuguese, it was published by a Holocaust survivor who took it upon him to print it in Portuguese. And it's of course available in German. So if you have a problem, let me know.
Okay, and they're asking how many kids do you have? Well, how many sons and daughters? And if you married the same Israeli girl from the beginning.
Okay, how many kids I have? Let me count one. I'm just kidding. I have 3 children, ranging between 32 and 26. 2 daughters, 1 boy. My oldest daughter is a physician assistant, specialist in emergency room in a hospital in downtown Manhattan, Presbyterian Hospital. I have the youngest daughter, her name is Natalia. My oldest is Jade, but the youngest is Natalia. She is an astrophysicist. What she knows about mathematics, the way she handles mathematics, I mean, I must be from somewhere else because I don't understand at all what she's doing, but I'm proud. My son is 32. He's a attorney in Miami. I cried about it for a while, but attorneys are people too. Just kidding. So, what was the next question?
That if you married the same.
Oh, if I married. Well, when I left Israel, we stood in touch maybe for a year or so. She went to the army and met somebody else. I met somebody else. It was just something that happened. But after my first presentation in Israel on Galei Tzahal, I gave an interview. It was in 2008, and she called in the producer of the story and said, "This voice I recognize, but they never spoke Hebrew. Who is? Can you give me the contact phone number?" And they gave it to her. And she contacted me in Miami. I flew a month later to her, met her again. She has a beautiful family. We spent some good time together, and we are still in touch.
Wow. Okay. And they're asking if your father was sometimes judged for the tribunal. He was judged.
Well, that is a good question. Now, I'm not preface what I'm saying right now. I'm eternally grateful for the Americans, what they have done in what life they've sacrificed to liberate my country, to allow me to grow up as a free man. I'm always emphasize that I owe Americans in America a big hug. But when Americans in May 1945, and 9th of May 1945, when the war ended, the Americans in the zone saw what happens. They had not very happy thoughts about Germans. Now you can imagine that my father, who was in April 1945, was spearheading the last Tiger tank commander, which was in the most advanced German tank, to prevent the Americans to cross the River Rhine. He was captured, and it was just a few months after the war in the Ardennes, the massive loss of life and murder, and the SS committed horrific crimes against humanity, but they didn't look at a German officer a bit too kindly. They're locking up in a cage. She was held in 1 year in American detention, for 1 year in British detention. I have found the part of the denazification and interview protocols in Germany, and he was considered to be a third degree Nazi. So he was punished by not allowing to take any security sensitive jobs, police, banks, and so on. He peddled books from door to door salesmen and other items. And in 1956, he was called upon by the then new West German army under the command of course, a democratic German president. He was called upon to be an instructor for Americans, for Germans, for American soldiers, training on the American tanks and training to know German army and American tanks. And for this, he became a colonel. He, quote unquote, graduated in 1958 and joined the West German Ministry of Civil Defense and retired from that. So he was never thrown to jail. He had never a direct consequence, if you consider prison for a year as a consequence, but he survived in a sick way.
Okay, and you told us that you went home. This is the last question. Thanks for your time.
Whatever question you want.
Thank you. And you told us that you went back home with your father and your mother to say goodbye. They were at the door and your father shouted you that you go, and your mother was crying. Did they know that you convert, or just they were angry because you hate what had happened?
They knew that I converted because somebody told them. My father was highly admired by the generation after him, by the tanker generation, I call them, the tank commander. And he was very tightly connected to the soldiers and officers in the Bundeswehr and the German army. So even though he was not serving there anymore and he was not advising anymore, he was in touch with them. And one of his friends, who was in military intelligence during the war, and it was again with the Americans in military intelligence, he said, look, your son, I found out it did something that I don't think we can endorse. He said, what? He converted to Judaism and is on the way to Israel. He probably joined the army, and God knows what he was going to do and talk. So that was, my father knew that I had not only proclivity, but that I did it. He actually died in June 1987, 1st of June 1987, 30th of May 1987, the day before his birthday. He stipulated in letters that he sent to me, copied to me, I never opened them until 5 years ago, that this individual, meaning me, cannot use the name Bolshevik anymore, was declared to be a traitor to the family, should never attend his graveside, not even attend his funeral, that I'm a non-persona, a persona non grata. Well, I really didn't give a hoot about it, what persona non grata I am, because I never abided him, but he was disowned. The thing is, the painful aspect is not only that you're getting disowned by your father, but disowned by your family, because you have to live with that. But I found a home, I found a family, I found a safe environment as a Jew, as an Israeli, and I never regret what I did. The only regret that I have is that I learned how to make gefilte fish the Polish style, gefilte fish out of raw fish, and taught by Polish Jews, and I said, guys, I will never eat that. I make it, but I will never eat that. That was the only regret that I had. Just kidding.
And okay, one more question. Thank you.
Please.
Your siblings. Did you have siblings? And
I had two sisters. Yeah, I had two sisters.
they didn't.
One sister.
After that.
Pardon me?
They didn't look for you or try to reach you to get back.
Well, not for 20 years. Not for almost 20 years. I had an older sister, Krista. She was 10 years older than I am. She died 12 years ago. And she told me my father's story. I was the first family member that I contacted. She contacted me I was in Florida at that time. And she found out that I'm alive, and she contacted me and I visited her. She unfortunately died from cancer, but gave me a lot of information about the family. My younger sister, Helga, she lives in Bamberg. She's 3 years younger than I am. She lives in Bamberg and is still in the same city. And I didn't connect with her until 8 years ago. And she has 3 children. And I started to connect to her, and we met in person. And her children came to the United States to meet me because they said, you're such a famous guy in Germany, they'd have a film about you. I never thought I would have such a cool uncle. I said, look, I'm not cool, I'm your uncle, but if you need anything, you can come to me. So I have a good relationship with the generation, but they still digest how you do something like that. That's radical change, but they understood, they understand.
Okay, thank you so much. You have a lot of merit to came from that and to be what you are today. Really.
תודה.
Thank you so much.
לילה טוב, חג שמח, ונתראה בקרוב.
And all your family with all the blessings. Thank you so much.
תודה רבה.
You make our night really special. Thank you. Thank
Well,
you.
I love Mexico. I always loved it. So
Yes.
thank you for giving me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye
Good
bye.
night.
להתראות. לילה טוב.
Laila Tov. Bueno, la verdad es que como que sin palabras, ¿no? Está espectacular, espectacular. Y por ahí preguntaron que si mató a Yehudim. Sí, super mató a Yehudim, su papá, de los de alto rango. Y bueno, la verdad es que nos llevamos un mensaje espectacular. Si él, de donde estaba, regresó al judaísmo y entregó todo lo que entregó por lo que nosotros nacimos, ¿cuánto tenemos que aprovechar y darle gracias a Hashem por lo que somos? De verdad, Baruch Hashem, que somos Am Israel, que Hashem nos llene siempre de luz, que esa luz de la Hanukkah nos alumbre hasta 120 años y nos llene de milagros, Bezrat Hashem. Y que hoy, quiero que sepan que hoy es una noche muy especial, muy, muy especial. Dicen que las tefilot, que los rezos de los tzadikim que hacen en Yom Kippur y en Rosh Hashanah no llegan al nivel de los rezos que hacemos hoy, esta noche, que están todas las luminarias prendidas, así que hay que echarle muchas, muchas ganas. De pronto veamos la llegada del Mashiach. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Hanukkah Sameach, Shavua Tov y todo lo bueno. Perdón, con la adrenalina del doctor y el hablar el inglés se me fue a agradecer muy especial a Jajam Abraham Cohen, que nos hace siempre, como siempre, la verdad, un gran trabajo con la traducción al español. Jajam Abraham, mil gracias. De verdad que Baruch Hashem, que te tenemos para estas cosas que hacen toda la diferencia y que hacen que mucha más gente pueda ver y entender. Muchísimas gracias, de verdad.